Great to have you here at the Gonzaga Socratic Club. If you don't know much about the club, we meet about once a month during the academic year, and the approach that we take is to examine Christian worldview issues from a philosophical point of view. We take our name from the Oxford Socratic Club of the 1900s, which became pretty well known thanks to its president, a well-known Christian apologist named C.S. Lewis. And the Oxford Socratic Club was really a very interesting organization. It was a club that really took all comers. They had atheists, critics, skeptics, and also committed Christians of all stripes. And they met weekly. I just think it's amazing. They had an academic society. I think it's hard enough for us to organize a meeting once a month. But they met every week, and some of the big heavy hitters of that era who were involved in all kinds of issues, academic, theoretical, theological, philosophical, historical, were involved in the Oxford Socratic Club. And we try to do something like that. We treat issues like the problem of evil, and we've talked about mission in higher education on a number of occasions, but we also do much more academic and theoretical stuff as well. We've looked at questions like human nature and the epistemology or the theory of knowledge behind religious belief and so forth. So we're glad you're here. Thanks for coming. We are going to look today at the question of Jesuit mission in higher education. And if you've been around Gonzaga or any Jesuit institution very long, you know good and well that if you ask people, what does Jesuit mean? Or what is Jesuit mission? You're likely to get a great plurality of answers. You've probably heard, I've heard this joke applied to all different religious traditions. My own religious tradition is Baptist, as a matter of fact. I'm not Catholic. But the joke goes that if you put 5 Baptists in a room, you're going to have 7 opinions. Well, I'm sure that something very similar is true about Catholics, and especially when they're talking about what Jesuit education or what it means to call something Jesuit is all about. If you have 5 folks in the room, you're probably going to have, I don't know, 7, 10, 15 opinions about what that's all about. Today we're going to look at that question, and we have made a point. The Socratic Club is dialogic. As a practice, we normally have a speaker and a respondent. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently. But we're specifically going to focus on having a conversation. So I hope you came prepared to engage in some verbal, metaphorical fisticuffs anyway. And you're ready to throw out some ideas, and we'll see where they go. Our suggestion today, though, is that we're going to start by looking at a reference document. And if I was more organized, I'd know where the little clicker was to be able to do this. But we're going to be looking at a document that was produced by the United States Jesuit Conference Board in 2002, titled Communal Reflection on the Jesuit Mission in Higher Education, A Way of Proceeding. One of the things that we'll hear from our first speaker, our main speaker today, is that whenever something is in dispute or doubt, it's always helpful to look at the texts. To look at the text or texts that are involved. And this is a helpful text that was produced by the Jesuit Conference Board in the United States as a reference for how to think about Jesuit mission in higher education. And so we're going to be taking a look at that. I just want to say a few things about it to get us started. If you are you going to pull up the document itself? Okay, I do. It's online. I sent in the link of information about our meeting today, and you can look it up afterwards. If you look on the Socratic Club's website, it's got a link to the document itself. I want to say a couple of things about how it gets introduced, how it gets set up, and then our first speaker will be talking more about the details of what you'll find in the document, how it's produced, and some background about Jesuit education. I think it's really interesting that when the document begins in the introduction, the authors make a point of referring to one of the great Jesuit encyclicals of the last couple of decades on the topic of Catholic identity in higher education. It's Ex Corde Ecclesia, that was produced and published in 1990. The Latin name, if you know your Latin, is From the Heart of the Church. And in that encyclical, Pope John Paul II is arguing that Catholic higher education has a critical organic relationship to the mission and work of the Church as a whole. And we can't talk about the document as a whole, that document today, but there are a few things that I wanted to point out that the authors of the document we are going to focus in on, they extract a few key points that are in that Jesuit mission in higher education way of proceeding. And I want to just highlight those. I know the print's kind of small, I wanted to get it all on one page. But according to their reading, Ex Corde envisions a Catholic university as involving first a Christian inspiration, not only of individuals, but of the university community as such. That's really a rich statement already. We could talk a lot about that probably. It's got not only the idea of a community working together, which we're going to see gets replicated in the document we're going to be looking at today, but also the notion of Christian inspiration, which of course that idea of inspiration has a long and important history in Christian thought about God's revelation of himself, especially through the scriptures and the prophets. Secondly, a Catholic university involves a continuing reflection in the light of the Catholic faith upon the growing treasury of human knowledge to which it seeks to contribute by its own research. So we have there the idea of a body of knowledge, and we have not only the idea of a body of knowledge, it's not fixed and stale and dead, but it's a body of knowledge that is constantly nourished by new research and moving forward. Thirdly, fidelity to the Christian message as it comes to us through the Church. Wow, that's so controversial. I think I won't comment. So, well, there's the idea there, of course, that as that research gets done, that the university has a responsibility to remain focused and faithful to that message. And finally, an institutional commitment to the service of the people of God and of the human family in their pilgrimage to the transcendent goal which gives meaning to life. That's very John Paul II language there. If you think about that transcendent goal that draws people forward and enables us to develop and understand ourselves more fully. Now, the document includes a set of, we're back to now the Jesuit document. We're off Ex Corde now, so I'm clear about which documents we're talking about. In the document, they list a set of characteristics that Jesuit mission involves, Jesuit mission in higher education. We're going to focus on a couple of those, but I wanted to at least lay them out so that we'd have them as a point of reference. First, dedication to human dignity from a Catholic Jesuit faith perspective. Second, reverence for and an ongoing reflection on human experience. Third, creative companionship with colleagues. Fourth, focused care for students. And fifth, a well-educated justice and solidarity. Now, if you've been around Jesuit institutions for very long, a lot of this sounds very familiar, as it should, because this document is meant to be not a doctrine, not a document that introduces new ideas so much as it tries to articulate practice as we find it. Well, that's enough by way of introduction. We're going to hear from three people today. Our first and main speaker is Father Michael Maher of the History Department here at Gonzaga University, who's going to give us some background on why the Jesuits got themselves involved in education in the first place. And then we're going to hear from two speakers who are going to comment on the first two of those characteristics. Father Craig Hightower, the Director of University Ministry, will talk about the first one, and Margaret Rankin, who's a graduate student in the Philosophy Department and a recent convert to the Church in last January. So we'll hear from them in a moment, but for now, please welcome Father Maher. sign one for us. Right.
Here.
Sign off of this. We have to do a switch here, so just a moment.
While I'm doing
Now
that,
for the
can you
message
pull
from our
that thing
sponsor.
forward so I can
Oh,
access
yes.
do that? There's water, I'm sorry, there's a thing of water underneath.
Got it under control.
That's talent.
It did jiggle a little bit, but we're okay.
And I tell you what,
I didn't pass
I didn't
it.
pass it. I made a mistake. I put biography, it should be bibliography. And I'll explain that at the end, but we'll save some time for me.
Okay.
Ready to get out of this?
Next. And then I don't want to throw away this.
Thank you. Again, I have here, it's like bibliography here, I was attempting this. So, good afternoon and thank you for the Socratic Club for inviting us, and all of you who have come to this afternoon's presentation. If I may take the privilege, I'd like to dedicate this talk to John Hickey Wright of the Society of Jesus, who died almost 2 years ago. John Wright started an organization and was a Jesuit studying philosophy here that actually evolved to what is today the Socratic Club. And I can think of no memory better than his to evoke when coming to speak on Jesuit education and its enduring values and the texts and traditions on which this education rests. We may begin with one question. Why did the Jesuits turn to education as their primary apostolic venture? A venture that consumed at least 3/4 of the 1,000 Jesuits who were members of the Society of Jesus at the death of St. Ignatius in 1556. This is not a hypothetical question, since a ministry which consumed so many men and necessitated a stability which argued against the mobility desired by its founder. At its founding, Ignatius viewed the ministries of the Society as more mobile. That is, ministries that easily supported the transfer and limited presence of Jesuits in one place. There is an etching that was made for the beatification of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And it shows Jesuits preaching, teaching catechism, hearing confessions, and promoting frequent communion. Although these works provided the ministerial thrust for the Society of Jesus by 1551, Ignatius was arguing for educational institutions as one of the best means for promoting the goals of the Society of Jesus. What occurred that changed Ignatius's mind with the result that he created the first school system in the world? That's a fact that some people don't realize, is the Jesuit education was the first school system. There were other schools, certainly, the University of Paris, cathedral schools, all that. But this was the first school system that implemented a system that both had internal verification on what they were doing and external verification to replicate the model from one to the other. And one of the things that the Jesuits actually invented, I don't know if there were more faculty or I'd get a boo, was outcomes assessment. The answer to this question of why the Jesuits turned to education may be best answered by answering the question, why did Ignatius himself turn to education in his own life? And then we may better understand why he implemented education as the principal work of the Society of Ignatius dealt with his early life in a summary sentence. Referring to himself in the third person, he stated, "Up to the age of 26, he was a man given to the vanities of the world. And what he enjoyed most was warlike sport, with a great and foolish desire to win fame. Part of this fame included the futile defense of a fortress in Pamplona, Spain. In this battle, Ignatius suffered a wound to his right leg, which necessitated a lengthy recovery. Since warlike sport interested him in other vanities of the world, and here you can read between the lines, which allowed for the probable breakage of every commandment, Ignatius requested from his sister-in-law while he was recovering the standard novel of the time, which described knight errantry, ladies in distress, affairs, battles, and violence. In short, it was a 16th century video game. He was actually called, he took back to, I gotta tell you this little anecdote, went back to Loyola Castle to recover from this battle. They fixed his broken leg, but they didn't do a very good job of fixing it. And so he asked that it be rebroken and recast, because in the Renaissance, men wore those tight leggings, you know, and with that bone sticking out, that wouldn't look very good. So there's a reason why Jesuits are kind of attentive to the way they dress, because it comes from that. Anyway, so he asked for this book, the stories of Adamus and Gaul. It will always be my opinion that every castle had a copy of Adamus and Gaul. And the likelihood of the castle being without Adamus and Gaul is the same likelihood of the Jesuit residents not having Scotch. What happened next had the profoundest consequence in the life of Ignatius and the future of Jesuit education. His sister-in-law, perhaps of the opinion that some moral realignment was necessary, gave our recovering soldier 2 books: Ludwig of Saxony's Life of Christ and Jacob de Varagna's Life of the Saints. While in bed, Ignatius thought of the glories of chivalry described in Adamus and Gaul, and then at times he considered the stories he read about Christ and his saints. While lying in bed, Ignatius noted that when he recalled the exploits of dash and honor typical of the stories contained in Adamus and Gaul, he at first became interested, but then later on he was left feeling desolation and uninterested and uninspired. At first reading of the more spiritual books, he was nonplussed, but afterwards felt attraction, interest, and eventually felt called to live a new life. More time could be spent on the conversion story, but we may focus on one idea that proved to be the backbone of Jesuit spirituality and, by extension, Jesuit education. That persons can put before themselves ideas and activities that will assist them in moving closer to God. Here he is recovering, and I just want to point out here, so what happens in this sermon, conversion, he's thinking about the tales of Adamus and Gaul. He thinks about it, and what happens is, when he realizes it'll end, as he led to desolation, it doesn't really move him very much. But when he thinks about lives of the saints, it moves into consolation. And it comes up with a theory. And that idea is that persons can put for themselves things that will assist in receiving God's grace. And this is the Spanish word disponer, which has a very important meaning in Ignatian spirituality. It means making yourself available. This discernment of spirits, the idea that God works through feelings, emotions, and experiences, provided the foundation for Ignatius' spiritual exercises. He explained the exercises in the following way. By the term spiritual exercises, we mean every method of examination of conscience, meditation, contemplation, vocal or mental prayer, and other spiritual activities. For just as taking a walk, traveling on foot, and running are physical exercises, so it is the name of spiritual exercises given to any means of preparing and disposing our soul to rid itself of all disordered affections, and then, after the removal, of seeking and finding God's will in the ordering of a life for the salvation of our soul. Briefly then, the spiritual exercises were a means by which a person by a set of well-ordered means, could achieve a closer union with God. There is much more that can be said concerning this point, and here I will make a shameless pitch for a talk I'm going to be giving, I think in a couple of weeks, maybe after spring break, on the exact 3 points of the spiritual exercises that are applicable for Jesuit education. But for now, let me simply state that Ignatius created a well-ordered set of exercises that had as their end or focus the development of a stronger union with God. These exercises were created at a time, the time of the Reformation, in which there was incredible spiritual and emotional anxiety on how to best access the divine so as to gain eternal life. Whereas there were several books, spiritual books, such as The Imitation of Christ, Lives of the Saints, Lives of Christ, no book had created such a clear method. And this clear method was a shining beacon for an age fraught with anxiety. If I can put a little gloss on this. Basically, although the spiritual exercises, those of you who are familiar with it, are divided up into 4 weeks, the actual movement towards spiritual perfection is purgation, how we messed up, illumination, how are we going to, in purgation, in Ignatius, how you mess up and how you're going to remove that. So you take something away, then you have to put something in its place. That's called illumination. And then the final step is union. If you kind of want to understand any type of religious phenomenology, you look at the idea of there was a fall, and there has to be a return. You're illumined with a new body of information, and that leads you to union. So purgation, illumination, and union. One of the big crises of the age of Reformation was, am I doing this correctly? Am I accessing the divine? So, according to what historians would say, am I dying well? Am I going to die in a state of grace that's going to get me to the next life? And so what Ignatius did was, he created a very clean and accurate methodology of doing that. So that's a whole other, you have to take my Jesuit history course. And I'll explain, our thing on the spiritual exercise, on how that clearly ordered methodology occurred. So, briefly then, the spiritual exercises were a means by which a person, by a set of well-ordered means, could achieve a closer union with God. There is much more that can be said concerning this. Oh, I read that already. Sorry. Here we must move quickly through Ignatius' life and note that he developed further his spiritual insights, building on the original insights gained on his sickbed. Almost 2 years after his injury, he visited Jerusalem, wishing to stay and matching his fervor to evangelize the Moors. His strong fervor suggested to the Franciscan custodians that the best place for Ignatius was on a boat heading home. Returning to Spain, Ignatius realized that if he was going to help souls, he needed more education than the rudiments he had learned before his conversion. The first step in this process was learning Latin, since Latin was the universal language of the time. There he is. Oh, I missed that slide. There he is. He's on his way to Jerusalem. And here he is, learning. The first step in this process was learning Latin. Sitting with schoolboys at the age of 8 to 12, Ignatius studied Latin in the city of Barcelona. He never perfected Latin to the humanist standards of the age, but gained enough to begin his mastery in philosophy at the great university founded by Cardinal Cisneros in Alcalá. His studies in Alcalá may be characterized by a haphazard romp through the available courses, an indiscriminate race through requirements of the physics of Aristotle, the sentences of Peter Lombard, and the philosophy of Aquinas. In brief, he was racing around filling slots. Added to this, he spent much of his time working with the poor. Added to these things, he got in trouble with the authorities for supposedly advising the widowed woman and her son to vest their funds and go on pilgrimage. Added to this, he spent much of his time in various penances and even more work with the poor. He quickly realized that he had done a lot, but learned little. Taking a note from his own spiritual exercises and realizing that the enemy of our human nature can tempt us from the greater good by lesser goods, he thought a fresh start would be in order. He left for Salamanca. Unfortunately, soon after his arrival, He began street preaching, making distinctions between venial and moral sins, and promptly got in trouble with the Dominicans. When I say Dominicans, you go, boo. To such an extent that they landed him in jail for a month. Ignatius had learned a few lessons, and desiring to make a fresh start, he went on to the University of Paris and arrived there on February 2nd, 1528. This was like going to Berkeley. Everyone went to Paris. Interesting enough, one of Ignatius's classmates, his first year and John Calvin's last year. There's no record of them ever meeting, but they overlapped that 1 year. Much can be said about the University of Paris and its effect on Ignatius. It was in Paris that he gathered those companions which became the founding members of the Society of Jesus. It was in Paris that he came in contact with the myriad of issues of the day, both political and religious. And it was in Paris that he came in contact with the method of Paris, the modus parisiensis, which provided the structure for Jesuit education. So what was that? Well, what was the method of Paris? Well, we'll have a quiz here. Does anyone know what, except those of you who've had me, what was the trivia? What was the trivia? Well, yes.
Logic, rhetoric, and grammar.
Wrong. Well, you're sort of right. The reason is this. You've got the things right, but the order is absolutely crucial. What is grammar?
Language.
The study of a correct structure of a sentence. For example, all men are mortal. We don't say all men is mortal. We say all men are mortal. So we construct a correct sentence. The next step is logic. What is the correct relationship of those sentences to create an argument? All men are mortal. Socrates
Is a man.
and therefore,
Socrates is a woman.
okay, so you would see that you would take grammar first and logic second, and then you would take rhetoric. Rhetoric was the proper exposition of an argument, both orally and written. To understand good rhetoric, you studied the classics. You took the letters of Cicero, you studied the Caesar's Wars, and you learned both to speak and write correctly. That's why my students hate me, because I always say, get your hand away from your mouth and the tongue. It's to teach good rhetoric. Now, a little thing. In rhetoric, you took history, literature, what we would call like history, literature. That's where you took it. As a matter of fact, if you look at the old catalogs of Gonzaga University, they would say in this class you took rhetoric. Well, under rhetoric, you took your history courses. Because history was not only learning the lessons of history, but that's how you learn to read and write. As a matter of fact, you know how neuralgic we are about plagiarism. 400 years ago, if your essay didn't look like Cicero, you got kicked out. You know, that's how you learn to read and write, was you copied Cicero. So the next thing, we'll give you another chance. What's the quadrivium? This is tricky.
Well, I give you the 4. I don't know what the
Oh, give me the 4.
All right, it's math, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Oh, see, you're improving with age. Perfect. You got it. Now, just as there was proper order to this, there's proper order to the quadrivium. Mathematics is the study of numbers. Now remember, you've already taken logic. When you apply logic to mathematics, you come up with mathematical rules and primitives. If A plus B equals C, then C minus B equals A. Okay, that's taking the logic you learned and applying it for math. The next step is applying that mathematics to the 3 dimensions. That's geometry. So then you apply those mathematical principles then to geometry to understand things in space. Okay? The third thing may be confusing a little bit, and that's music. Okay, now music, as was understood back then in the Middle Ages and up to until really the 19th century, was geometry or proper relationships of tones. So for example, just as there's a proper relation of the radius to the circumference, so is there a proper relationship of music. For example, if I take a chord, piece of string, pluck it, I get a note, cut it in half, I get an octave, cut it in half again, I get a fifth, cut it in half, I get a third. Bum, 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 bum. Okay, that's beautiful. Somebody else sings it. But that is, so just as there is ratio and proportion in geometry, so that's applied to music. And then that music and that proportionality is moved then to the physical world, and particularly astronomy. Okay. We don't apply that methodology in the sciences today, but what was very clear was you don't take astronomy, like for example, you're going to, oh geez, I got to get astronomy, rhetoric, and math, and then you take something else. You follow precisely this. Now, what's important about this is if you notice, we're dealing with two aspects of the world. We're dealing with the physical world, especially the quadrivium. We're dealing with the human world of human relations in rhetoric. The next step is important, and this is philosophy, predominantly metaphysics. What occurs in metaphysics, then, is you apply that rationality, that reason that you learned, to the material world, and you come up with abstractions. If we were to do it today, we'd say, for example, I'm reading All My Children, I'm reading A Raisin in the Sun, I'm reading Death of a Salesman. Can I abstract from this a certain thing of human condition? Can I move from the detail of the specific thing itself? Can I move to some philosophical truths such as reason, justice, honesty, and truth? Can I move even further then to what can I assume to know about natural theology from knowledge of God by reason alone? For example, can I abstract that therefore there is a book, there must be a bookmaker, if there's reason applied from the book, well, you know the argument. Therefore, moving from this book to a knowledge of God. This is what we see, for example, in the 5 proofs of the existence of God. What can we know from the created world that moves us then to a knowledge of God? Finally, then, revealed theology by knowledge of God by faith. So, then, what basically occurs then is, starting at this reflection on the human condition, we apply logic to the human condition, we apply it to the physical world, we do this in a philosophical way that leads us to a knowledge of God that then is the stepping stone in which I'll say, I said, which made revealed theology a step and not a leap. Basically what we have in the method of Paris is what then turns out to be Jesuit education, a reasoned reflection on the material world, insofar as that reflection provided philosophical truths that then create a platform for revealed theology and then subsequent, or first natural theology and then revealed theology. So what's important about this is two things. Number one, the synthesis. Number two, the direction. That this always moves up to this idea of revealed theology. Okay. The method of Paris became the backbone of Jesuit education, and Ignatius insisted upon this point in the constitutions, various letters, and subsequent documentation touching upon the Jesuit education system. Now we must note here one very important fact in the point of Ignatius, this point of Ignatius' career. Can you imagine how he must have felt when he realized that a well-ordered movement through the various disciplines took one towards a knowledge of God, no different than a well-ordered movement through the spiritual exercises that brought one also to God. Here at Paris, Ignatius realized that education and spiritual growth both had the same goal, but a diversity of means. Means that encompassed the fullness of the human condition, intellect and spirit. It was in Paris that Ignatius realized that humanity could move towards a knowledge of God through a well-ordered progression of exercises. For Ignatius, a good education entailed a reasoned reflection on the material world and the world of human experience, the trivium and the quadrivium, which led to philosophical truths that's attained through metaphysics, in turn, which serve as a platform for natural theology, what we can know about God by reason alone, and then subsequently reveal theology, what we can know about God by faith. Making the movement from reason, then, step by step, made the attainment of the revealed theology, knowledge of Jesus, Mary, all the revealed facts, that then became a step and not a leap. The terminus in both projects was knowledge of God, which led to consequential acts of love of the Creator and love of the creature. We now move fast forward to the founding of the Society of Jesus on September 27, 1540. Ignatius perceived that a new type of religious order was required. A novelty, in fact, that gained some criticism. The Society of Jesus would not wear a characteristic habit, but they were to dress like diocesan priests. They would not say their prayers in common, and they would not sing office in common. They would also be known for their obedience to the papacy, an obedience that would enable them to go at a moment's notice to any place in the world. Evidence of this international view was Francis Xavier's departure for India soon after the order was established. It's always a consolation or a fact we have to remind rectors that at no time of the history of the Society of Jesus were all the Jesuits together in one room, so good luck getting them all together. In short, setting up institutions of education with emphasis on their permanence would be contrary to the crack mobility desired of Ignatius. Well, what happened? Well, because of the poor state of opportunities for education of priests, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you one statistic. 65% of the priests who were ordained at the time before the Council of Trent, 1530s, 1540s, 65% could only read Latin but had no clue of what they were saying. They had not, they basically, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. We have to go on to it. But 65% read Latin so they could say Mass. And there's a great saying in the church, ecclesia supplic, means I make Mass, but I'm doing what the church intends, so it's going to work anyway. 65% read with no understanding. That right there explains a whole lot of things. Okay. So the Jesuits educated young Jesuits in the method of Paris, so esteemed by St. Ignatius. In Gandia, where the Jesuits were educating what we call scholastics, young Jesuits, parents of young boys wanted the good education received by the Jesuits in this training. Parents quickly found out three things. It was an excellent education, the Jesuits did not beat their children, and it was free. And soon the city of Messina requested in 1548 a school, and Ignatius complied. Not without some concern or conference among the Jesuits in Rome. But after consideration, he realized that education provided the best means to advancing the ends of the society. As a matter of fact, in the Constitutions, in Part 7, when Ignatius is saying, what ministry should we take on, 1:622e says, pick the one, basically, I'm editing, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. If you're going to give spiritual direction to one person or 30 persons in a talk, you give them to 30, unless the guy's the prince of the realm. So if you want to educate people who are going to have the most influence. So in a letter justifying this new venture to the other Jesuits, who were kind of wondering because they had been fed on this, we got to be ready to pull up any moment, Ignatius writes a letter in 1551, and he explains why we're turning to education. And this is one little snippet that I think it's quite nice. From among those who are at present merely students, in some time they will depart to play diverse roles, one to preach and carry on the care of souls, another to the government of the land and the administration of justice, and others to other occupations. Finally, since young boys become grown men, their good education in life and doctrine will be beneficial to many others, with the fruit expanding more widely every day. And that fit clearly then with the ministerial goals of the society. Ignatius then took the next step. He created a school in Rome whose rules and manner of proceeding would be the template for all other schools. This was a change, but this change could perhaps mean a fulfillment for the goals of the Society of Jesus. And those goals were to strive especially for the defense and the propagation of the faith and for the progress of souls in Christian life and doctrine. The school would follow the modus parisiensis, as well as the new humanism and the spiritual insights of the Devotio Moderna. Basically what was going on was scholasticism got a black eye because it was arguing all this stuff about how many angels could dance on the head of the pin. And so there was a movement more towards mysticism and the Devotio Moderna that sort of rejected a high intellectualism. Well, one of the things that Ignatius did that was brilliant, he took the well-reasoned scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas and he paired it with the Devotio Moderna. So it was both piety and education that moved you forward. So he rehabilitated this very logical system of Thomas Aquinas, but he inculcated it with the strong devotional trend of the Devotio Moderna. Okay. At its heart was the movement towards Jesus, which was the same movement as identified in the spiritual exercises. So both the educational endeavor and the spiritual exercises had their same goal. To assure the success of this venture, Ignatius laid out a course of studies for Jesuits and lay students, which has come down to us in part as part 4 of the Jesuit constitutions. It is interesting to note that the introduction of this part, the part dealing with education, is the only place in the constitutions where Ignatius repeats the purpose of the order. Let me just read this to you real quick. Okay. So it says, this is part 4 of the constitutions. The aim which the Society of Jesus directly seeks is to aid its own members and their fellow men to attain the ultimate end for which they were created. To achieve this purpose, in addition to the example of one's life, meaning good life, learning and a method of expounding it are also necessary. Therefore, after the proper abnegation of themselves, and he's referring to young Jesuits at this point, is present, therefore we need to create a method of studies. During his lifetime, Ignatius created an order of studies known as the Rule of the Roman College of 1551, but then advised that a more detailed method, or ratio of studies, be created. A complement to the method he created for spiritual growth. So just as he created the codification and the spiritual exercises, he was working on a codification of education. A method, both methods, that had as their focus knowledge and a love of God. In brief, his method identified Jesuit education, philosophical in method, theological in focus, and supported by a rigorous analysis of the created world and the human condition. And so again, it was philosophical in method, theological in focus, but using the humanities, a very thorough analysis of the humanities as the basis of this investigation. The codification of this effort began with the composition of Part 4 of the Constitutions in 1548. The creation of the rules of the Roman College occurred in 1551. The first ratio, Code of Studies, was in 1585. Then there was a codified ratio again in 1591, and then the final ratio of 1599. Only 48 years and lots of committees. And the interesting thing is, you can read all their notes. There are 7 volumes of the Monumenta Pedagogica, and it's a fascinating read, but you gotta learn Latin first. George Gans, so, moving on to today. George Gans, in 1954, wrote a book which I think stands as the starting point for all conversations concerning Jesuit education. It's his book called St. Ignatius' Idea of a Jesuit Education. In this book, he noted that the times had changed, but the basics of a Jesuit education had to be articulated if any veracity could be attributed to a project that identified itself as Catholic and Jesuit. Here he laid out the project, which is the project we have before our universities today. What are the essentials of the Jesuit education? What are the essential characteristics in which those ideas are delivered? And then what matters are capable of being changed to accommodate time and place? So what we're looking at, what George is asking himself in this book is, what are the essentials of Jesuit education? What are the essential characteristics by which that product is delivered? And what can we come up to change? George Gans, I have the honor of saying I knew George. I ate breakfast with him for 3 years at St. Louis University. The man was brilliant. And what really bothered me, he was not only brilliant, but he was pious. And he was smart. And so, but what George could see in 1954 were the times were changing. And so what he began to articulate this question of what is essential, what's the essential delivery, and then what can we really change? And that was an important point. So the document, Communal Reflections, is one such effort in a long line of efforts. And David, you outlined it, so I'm not going to go into that. But basically what I kind of will stop now, and I don't know if you want to ask questions, is that from 1599, from the creation of the Ratio Studiorum up to now, Jesuits have been at this point of dialogue. And it really is what I would call the essential dialogue of Catholicism. What is absolutely essential, and what can you change? What is it that's going to, that you can change? It's what I call the difficulty of Roman Catholicism. How do you put an adjective on a noun that means universal? So there's always going to be this tension. What is it that's going to be essential, but how are you going to deliver this essential truth in local time and place? What I've done is I've passed out here a few things you can read, and I'm pulled it, but I'm going to put it back again on the Catholic Studies webpage. And what I've started here is sources, documents, because I think it's very important to start with a document because it kind of objectifies the conversation. Not that it's limited to this document, but it serves as a ground. So what I've done here is I put here sources from the Roman Catholic hierarchy. These are all Vatican documents from the popes. And I've listed in chronological order to kind of give you a sense of the progression. Then I put here sources of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States, the Conference of Bishops. Now, putting together a bibliography is like thanking people for their efforts on the prom. You always forget somebody, you get somebody upset. So anything you see, geez, Maher, why don't you include this? Send it to me and I'll put it in and it'll appear in the webpage. Then sources of the Society of Jesus that are listed by superior generals. Okay. And where it's been appropriate, I have the link, but when you access the webpage, you can link it real carefully, link it clearly. And then on the last page, the Jesuit conference itself. So I'm going to stop here because I want to certainly have more time for discussion. Any quick questions on what I've said? Okay.
You're going to have lots more questions.
Father Craig, why don't you go ahead?
So he puts the list back up. One of the great things about the Society of Jesus' method of education is that we can demonstrate that it works quite often by who is the teachers themselves. So some of you are educated by Jesuits. Father Maher was educated by Jesuits. I actually have 2 degrees from Gonzaga University, so I was also educated here. I'm not going to ask him to look up the reports I wrote for him, but I had both Dr. Gallivan and Dr. Koch as teachers and instructors myself. So it's kind of nice to be able to be invited in here. Usually after I speak, after a Jesuit, I use the story of a Hugo Rahner in light of his brother Karl Rahner. Most of you know that Karl Rahner was absolutely brilliant. His head was so far in the clouds that Microsoft hadn't invented the cloud yet. He was way up there. Hugo used to say that his whole purpose of being born and raised was so he could interpret his brother to the public. Usually that's what I end up doing, but Father Maher was very clear. One of the things we're going to look at very briefly is what does it mean to be a Jesuit school? What does that mean? We have the historical context, but in particular, what does that mean in the context of today's realities? Polarization of the church and society here in America, and certainly a polarization based on geographical differences of the church overall in the world. And what is the role, therefore, of a Jesuit education in that? To do that, I'm going to just talk real briefly about another Jesuit who we have a building on our campus named after. And his name was Pierre Today Chardin. And he was a French Jesuit who used to teach, believe it or not, in Egypt in the early 1900s. From there, he was quite frankly, he was silenced by the church, He did a lot of work in the natural sciences, and he was actually one of the discoverers of Peking man. And because of his background, he wrote a lot about Genesis, and he wrote a lot about the development of the human soul and the human nature. And that led him to be at odds with the church, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. One of the things that happened when he was asked to be silenced, or when he was told that he could no longer publish, and in 1924 he gave a brief interview. And he said two things in that interview which I think speak to the heart of what it means to be a Jesuit institution. One is, he said, and he used male-dominated language, but he said, "I reserve the right to enter into and have conversation with professional men." Meaning, he did reserve the right to do academic research. He reserved the right to be educated, and he reserved the right to educate. The second thing he said is, "I reserve the right to aid and comfort the soul." And if the first thing speaks of what we do at an educational institution, and what we do at a school of higher education, which is to enter into conversation and dialogue with each other for the purpose of education, the second one truly speaks of what it means to do that in an Ignatian Jesuit way. The constitutions that Father Maher held up for you, this nice little red book here, and all the commentaries on the Constitution, you will see over and over and over again the words to aid, to comfort, to help. And so if the first project is education, the second project is to do in such a way that gives comfort to the soul. And if we don't do those, then it cannot be a Jesuit education. That means that we walk the line between Christ and culture. Indeed, one of the things that Jesuits do in the dedication of human dignity from a Catholic Jesuit faith perspective is that we are a Roman Catholic institution. We are Catholic priests. Many of us are, the Jesuits at least, and we have been vetted over and over and over. I'm sure Father Maher can outline for you the way we have informatios written on us. The reality is that to go from each stage of Jesuit formation, we get graded and judged quite often. Not all those judgments are positive, let me tell you. Mr. LaBelle could tell you that when I was removed from Gonzaga Socratic for a while. It's something that happens. But at the same time, we're confirmed in what we do by the church, by our superiors. And so that's an important thing, that we are a Catholic institution. But we also work in the world. We work in a world that is vastly different from our own when we were younger, but also in a world that is vastly different in the past, in the present, and in the future. And so what a Jesuit does, and what those that work alongside Jesuit colleagues, what they do is they bridge that gap between Christ and culture. One of the teachers I had used to tell the joke that, of course, Catholicism is a very big tent. And as Father Maher pointed out, Catholicism, Catholic, just means, it's a Greek word that means universal. Well, if Catholicism is a very big tent, a Jesuit is standing at the doorway with one foot in and one foot out. But it is not to be, the movement is not to be moving out of the tent. The movement is to be holding open the flap so that more can come inside the tent. And that's what we do as educators. We try to make that. So when we look at these things, and I'm just going to do the first two really quick. Dedication to human dignity. Again, this is what we do when we talk about aiding and comforting. And we have to employ the different theologies that are available to us. A theology, right now we have a big dialogue around gay marriage and same-sex rights. So there is a dialogue between what we call the theology of chastity and the theology of justice. One is clearly allowing for certain marriages not to take place, and that's a sound and perfectly sound theology. The other one, the theology of justice, means that we give inherent human rights to individuals as created by the divine figure in the divine image. And it says nothing about orientation. And so therefore we would have to argue for same-sex marriage and same-sex rights. Those two goals would seem to be at opposition to each other. But entering into the process with the idea to both educate and aid and comfort, we could do that. And both are legitimate, and both are Catholic, and both are fair, and both are open and honest within the magisterium of the church. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about being Christ and culture. We are people, we are educators in the world, but we are not of the world. And we have to make that separation out. The second point here is a reverence for and an ongoing reflection on human experience. Again, this is one of the older projects. And again, this is what Father Maher lined out when he talked about the method at the University of Paris and how Ignatius tied that methodology into a reflection, a pious reflection on the divine. What we do is we do it within a context. And to just talk briefly for a second or two on that, I'm going to give you a quote from Pedro Rupe. Some of you might know that Pedro Rupe was our former Father General. He was, after a stroke, was also not silenced, but was, we had an administrator given to the Society of Jesus by the Pope during his time when he had a stroke. And Pedro Rupe is kind of a legend for most Jesuits. Is that fair for me to say?
Yeah.
He's legendary. We'll say he's legendary.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes.
He is the founder of Jesuit Refugee Services. He has actually experienced humanity at its worst, living through the bombing of Nagasaki when he was superior in Japan, and also living through humanity at its finest in the Second Vatican Council, and actually being one of the people that got to participate in the very last session there. And what he talked about was, he talked about, again, these constitutions. And this is his quote. He says, "The essence of Jesuit identity is an attitude of discernment fostered by the spiritual exercises." And again, as we've already learned this afternoon, the purpose of the spiritual exercises, the movement of the exercises, is to know the heart of Jesus. And so the essence of the Jesuit identity is an attitude of discernment fostered by the spiritual exercises. These constitutions, which are our guiding documents, are always to be read in the light of the exercises and not vice versa. What this allows is it allows for an incredible amount of freedom, because Rupe expects Jesuits and people that work alongside Jesuits to behave in a Jesuit way. And that order of freedom really allows and is the benefit of those that are working in writing and reading, those that are working in theology and preaching, those that are working in rhetoric. There's a freedom, but it's an ordered freedom. It's within the context of a faith. So one of the things we have to point out is that the first apostolic principle, to be a Jesuit school, we have to have the promotion of faith. That is not a fancy slogan. It's not something for a t-shirt. It's not something that's debatable. It is the promotion of faith. That is what it means to have a Jesuit school. And we do that by educating the person. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Rankin, because I do want to allow everyone to talk before we open it up to questions for everyone. But the last thing I'm going to mention is one of the goals that we have at a Jesuit institution, and this is from our last Father General. And this was an article he gave in an Italian newspaper. I am going to read it in English because I do not speak Italian and you would not want me to try. But this is an article he gave to Renzo Baccacoretti. And it was an interview when he was getting ready to step down from being Father General of the Society of Jesus. One of the things that's interesting about Father Kovenbach is that he was bi-ritual. He was a Roman Catholic, and he was responsible and in charge of the largest Roman Catholic religious order in the world, the Society of Jesus. But he was also a Malkite. He was not pure Roman. And so he's a Catholic who did not follow all the rules of the Roman. He followed the rules, but he was not part. He had both rights. And again, that's what we mean, that you sometimes walk a fine line, and that tension between the two allows you to do it well. But this is what he says about Jesuits, and this is what he says in particularly about some of you, our alumni. The Society hopes its former pupils, and by society he means Jesuit educators, and so that means all of us. The Society hopes its former pupils will be socially recognizable as such, not only and not mainly by certain traits most easily specified, competence and qualification, but by their commitment to the service of fundamental Christian and human values. It would like them to be mature personalities, rich in kindness, and anxious to commit themselves to the cause of true justice and to the generous service of the people of God. We would like all our pupils to be the living expression in whatever environment they find themselves to be of the pedagogical ideas that Father Maher and I have just been describing. He doesn't say that part, I added to it. But really what it means is that we do a faith that does justice, and we educate that, and we educate around that. one of the things the Socratic Club allows us to do, one of the benefits is it really makes that connection between faith and reason. Because as the Vatican I told us, they can never be in conflict with each other. They always go hand in hand. The purpose of finding that reason is something that Aquinas worked on, and we've worked on for hundreds of years. And how to work at faith is something that Ignatius put in, but we've also been doing for a long, long time. To bridge the gap between the two is the goal of the Jesuit education. So before we go to all the questions, I'm going to turn to Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank you, but just want to clarify, I'm definitely not a doctor.
Oh, sorry.
Well, my reflections were really just sort of more personal reflections on my experience here. So, when I think actually, I don't know if I do. I probably do. So I quote a couple of times from the little paragraph, the reverence for an ongoing reflection on human experience. So I'm just commenting only on the second point. The question, there are sample focus questions, and the one that I thought was the most interesting, and my comments sort of relate to this, is the first one. And it says, how is the Catholic and Jesuit character of your institution reflected in your undergraduate curriculum, graduate programs, and professional schools, e.g. in calling attention to the ethical and religious dimensions of every study, in hiring only faculty open to the full mission of the school, and in making known the specifically Catholic position on issues? Overall, though, well, I kind of feel like I should read this. I'm just going to read the second point, just so it's clear. The Jesuit university or college must be a place of intellectual honesty, pluralism, and mutual respect, where inquiry and open discussion characterize the environment of teaching, research, and professional development. The idea of reverence was a pivotal one for St. Ignatius Loyola. For him, reverence was first an attitude of regard before the majesty of God, but it was also a regard for all that God had created, as both a gift from God and a way into God's presence. Inspired by this sense of reverence, the Jesuit ideal of seeking and finding God in all things presupposes this genuine regard for the mystery within the universe. It is an ideal that gives serious attention to those great and abiding questions about the meaning of life and the conduct of human affairs. It is an ideal that encourages an openness of mind and heart to the varieties of ways in which the human spirit has named God and defined the moral life. It is an ideal that promotes a rigorous yet sensitive attention to the demands of the professions and of technology. It is an ideal that exults in the world of creative energy in literature and music, in art and theater, business, and the sciences. It is an ideal that engages the world both locally and globally. Okay, so let me start by saying that I actually am often impressed with Gonzaga's efforts in this regard. Although I may have concerns about the realization of other Catholic or Jesuit goals here, I do think that there's a great effort placed on being respectful of all views, encouraging openness and discussion, and being involved in both the local and global community. However, there's a significant way in which I think all the talk of openness, reverence, and dialogue may be misunderstood, or at least taken out of context, i.e. out of the context of the Catholic Church's teachings, in a way that is not healthy for a Catholic university at times. And unfortunately, one sees this danger at Gonzaga as well as in the wider Catholic culture in America. So first of all, there's two broad points I just wanted to touch on. When attempting to dialogue about how to have reverence for the human experience, it seems to me you must have some sort of agreement about what human experience is. Right off then, we have a problem. On the one hand, there's the Jesuit ideal of seeking and finding God in all things, which, in quotes, presupposes this genuine regard for the mystery within the universe. On the other hand, if the concept of authentic human experience is merely neurons firing and chemical levels in the brain, or, on the other extreme, merely a string of emotive responses to things that inexplicably happen, it's going to be difficult to dialogue about much. So I guess at a basic level, I think that a Catholic Jesuit school needs to have a solid foundation, i.e. core curriculum possibly, for an understanding of human nature. What does it mean to be human? It is perfectly possible to be open-minded and reverent toward the variety of human experience and relation to God, while still establishing early on that we have to agree on some things in order to dialogue at all. Now, building on that, when it comes to dialogue about moral issues, one should not assume, I think, that this means an endorsement of unhealthy moral belief. Although truly, in quotes, it is an ideal that encourages an openness of mind and heart to the varieties of ways in which the human spirit has named God and defined the moral life, there must also be some agreement on what it means to be a moral being, and indeed a moral being situated within some kind of natural law before any reasonable exploration can take place. Secondly, I just wanted to touch on the three qualities listed at the beginning of the second point. Quoting, intellectual honesty, pluralism, and mutual respect, where inquiry and open discussion characterize the environment of teaching, research, and professional development. So, we have these three: intellectual honesty, pluralism, and mutual respect, that should all be present in dialogue within the university. Well, clearly, no one has much an issue with pluralism, it seems. It's very well liked in the air these days, particularly as regards religious pluralism. However, I think there is a reason why all three are listed together, all of these points. And I think that any one of them could be possibly blown out of proportion.
The Augustinian tradition would, of course, identify itself with St. Augustine. After Augustine is writing after the fall of the Roman Empire, and after what he saw was this sort of collapse of human ingenuity. Quoting Augustine, I always say Augustine is the Walmart of theology, because anything you want, you find Augustine. So, and I'm safe. But there's probably in Augustine a suspicion of human intellect. And I say this, saying this, but probably Augustine, after he witnesses the fall of Rome, human sinfulness, he's arguing against Pelagianism, he is not going to be so banking on the probity and the goodness of human will. Jesuits, on the other hand, and this was something that's very characteristic of Maher, Alberto de Nobili, and all the Jesuit missionaries, probably have a greater proclivity towards an implicit and a presumed goodness of the human will. That's what got us in trouble with this nature and grace controversy in 1600. So that would be one thing. That probably the starting point is different, but the terminus is the same. So what you'll get in a Jesuit, a traditional Jesuit education, which you saw in the Rome College starting in 1551, is a greater emphasis on the hard sciences. In that what I showed you there is like, that was that Timothy, how do you prove the existence of God? You don't quote the Bible, you look at that table. And you say, table, table maker, da, da, da. Does that make sense? And then therefore the starting point is much more a respect of the created world, that it is good, and that the human intellect is good, and that one of the great things that go on in the spiritual exercises is this presumption of the goodness of human nature. And that was revolutionary. Because remember, this is written during the Spanish Inquisition, not known for its wider interpretation. So probably there's a probity of the will, there's a probity in goodness of human nature, there's a probity in the goodness of creation. Putting that together will move you towards God. Augustine will talk about the goodness of humanity redeemed. You get to the same place, different stuff.
Any thoughts about the Dominican mission?
Well,
Obviously, that's not as widespread, but
I think it goes to the same thing. It's the overseeing philosophical and theological maneuvering within that religious order and those traditions are all going to be different based on when they were founded. So we have different viewpoints of how the religious order came about. The Society of Jesus fundamentally is a Renaissance humanistic religious order. Ignatius was born in 1491. So this age of discovery, this new cultures taking over the world and all this new information, that's the balance in which we were working, the early Jesuits were working in. That would be different than some of the other religious orders that have a very particular charism for this or for that. Ours is not limited in scope. It's really much broader. That deals with the magis and the joy and glory and things like that.
Practically what happened too was the Jesuit system, since it was really the first system, a lot of the modern, when I use this after the French Revolution, a lot of modern Catholic education looked to Jesuit paradigms. even on Notre Dame's webpage, they will say, copy the Jesuit Ratios to New York, because the Jesuits at St. Louis University, Loyola, Chicago, and Marquette, and they were asked to run this college. They said, there's just no way. But we do know these guys called the Fathers of the Holy Cross. Ask them. So they came down to St. Louis University, and they said, here's how you do it, and they took it. So in the post-19th century worldview, you're not going to get a whole lot of difference in Catholic education.
Thank you.
There's got to be some more questions.
We were on a preview day today for prospective students, and during the tour portions, in 2 different locations, different parents asked questions of different guides, how many Jesuit faculty, percentage-wise on campus as opposed to secular and things like that. And both of the respondents, one was somebody from the admissions office, and the other was a professor, talked about the dwindling numbers of Jesuits in general, and how that's changing. So what do you foresee for changes in Jesuit education based on lack of new members coming into the order, that kind of thing?
I think you're going to have to, one thing that might be helpful is to make a distinction, and the Jesuits themselves are of a different mind about this. But one of the things we would look at is what does it mean to be Jesuit educated, and then how do you empower that knowledge to others going forward in the process. So right now, I don't think it is a big danger. It's not a worry, because so many of our faculty, so many of our staff, certainly our administrators, are Jesuit educated. So what is the difference then between Jesuits, which are members of a religious order with vows, as opposed to Ignatian educators, which embody all the same elements without those particular religious vows, and how do they communicate that language? One of the things a lot of the 28 Jesuit universities in the United States are doing is putting a lot of emphasis on Jesuit mission and identity. So we've had a VP for mission here. We're currently in a search for a VP for mission, and that individual, working in collaboration with everybody, will not be responsible for, but will have a certain amount of responsibility for animating that discussion among our faculty and our administration, so that we do not lose that central characteristic of what it means to be at a Jesuit school.
Interesting thing. How many of you have heard of the Jesuit reductions? You've seen the movie The Mission? Do you know what I'm talking about? 5,000 Guaranese, 1 priest, 1 brother, and no email. And yet those were one of the most paradigmatic Jesuit institutions. In Jesuit history, it was